I'm Slava Silva. Welcome to Conversations with Slava. Today I'm talking to John Feffer, Director of Foreign Policy in Focus at the Institute for Policy Studies, author of the books Aftershock, A Journey into Eastern Europe's Broken Dreams, Splinterlands, and the upcoming sequel Frostlands. First, I would like to address the recent events, including what happened on Capitol Hill on January 6, 2021. On that day, you published the article Knives Out, Boycott, Purge, and Prosecute. There, you state the United States hasn't faced a crisis of legitimacy like this since the Civil War. What has happened since November 3rd is an attempted coup, and the perpetrators, including the president, cannot be allowed to get away with treason. Please explain, why are terms such as attempted coup and treason appropriate here?
Sure. Well, first, interestingly, I published that on January 6th, and it was maybe 2 hours before the assault on the Capitol. So it was in some ways premature, my conclusions, but they held, obviously. They applied as well to the events that happened later in the day. But prior to January 6th, of course, the President Trump refused to acknowledge the results of the election in November. And he not only insisted that there was fraud, he and his colleagues filed as many suits as they could in courts, particularly in states where the election results were close: Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Georgia, filed suits to overturn those results and either declare them null and void in certain parts of the states, or to rerun the election in those states. And all of those suits were thrown out because there was no evidence of fraud, no evidence that the election was flawed really in any significant way. There may have been, of course, a handful of votes that were miscounted, and that was the case when recounts took place in Georgia and in a couple of different districts in Wisconsin, but there was nowhere near the number of votes that would change the ultimate results in those states, or the results overall in the United States. So Trump continued to insist, despite lack of any evidence, that he had in fact won the election, and not just won the election narrowly, but won by a landslide. When the legal challenges failed, he continued to try to find ways of overturning the election. Perhaps the most significant one, and the one that I was referring to in terms of unconstitutional action, was his couple of phone calls to officials in Georgia, the Secretary of State there, for instance, to pressure them to find votes for him, to basically change the results of the election. And this is basically election fraud. And it is an impeachable offense. So even before the events of January 6th, Donald Trump was clearly in violation of the Constitution and could have been impeached on those charges alone. But of course, January 6th was a watershed event in terms of how the Republican Party and even members of his own base began to desert the president. And they deserted the president because on January 6th, in front of a rally devoted to this story of a stolen election, the president urged them to basically march up to the Capitol building, a short distance away from the rally down near the White House, and bring their message to people like the vice president, Pence, and wavering members of the Republican Party to continue to challenge the results of the election on this day, January 6th, which was the day that Congress was supposed to confirm the results of the Electoral College, and which then Vice President Mike Pence was supposed to kind of officially declare the end of the election and the victory of Joe Biden. And this incitement to insurrection in many ways backfired. I mean, it backfired obviously because the group broke into the Capitol building and engaged in any number of criminal acts, and backfired because even Trump's Republican allies began to desert him. And now we're, of course, on the verge of a second impeachment. The House has drawn up articles, and whether it proceeds to an actual trial in the Senate is unclear. But what is clear is that a number of key Republicans, such as Liz Cheney, who's third most powerful Republican in the House, and even Mitch McConnell in the Senate, have indicated that they support impeachment, which is really unprecedented because the Republicans held firm during the first impeachment proceedings over Trump's use of his office to basically pressure Ukrainian leader to provide information that would be useful for Trump's campaign in leading up to November. The Republicans held firm during those impeachment hearings, and now they've begun to desert him. So in some ways, we reached a kind of the most dangerous point, I think, leading up to January 6th, because in some sense, the country was more evenly polarized. I think it's less polarized now. The public opinion polls suggest that a significant portion of even Trump supporters within the party have deserted him, and there is a widespread acknowledgement that the Biden administration is going to take office on Inauguration Day, and the question remains really two questions that remain. One is, what will happen to Donald Trump? Will he be stripped of any of his kind of privileges that come to ex-presidents, former presidents? And second, what will the remnant of his supporters do? What are their plans? I mean, they have a number of plans between now and the inauguration, a million militia march on capitals throughout the United States, state capitals, as well as the US Capitol, actions on Inauguration Day. But the real question is, what will they do over the next 4 years? What kind of resistance will they mount to the Biden administration?
The term treason, it carries enormous weight. Why is it justified? Why is it more than just a group of a big group of violent people?
The charge of treason is attached to acts which are designed to basically overthrow the political system in the United States. And Trump was clearly interested in overturning the laws of succession from one administration to another, interested in overthrowing the procedures of democracy, the confirmation of the votes at the state level, confirmation by the Electoral College, confirmation by the US Congress of the Electoral College, so the procedures of the election. And not only verbally, because that is, of course, one element of treason, but to actually incite to insurrection raises it to yet another level of seriousness and of urgency. So he didn't just stand in front of the crowd and say, the election was stolen, I love you, go home. That would have been one thing. He said, the election was stolen, I love you, and now you have to act. And so that is literally incitement, incitement to treason, or incitement to insurrection, which then carries the weight of treason in terms of what Trump's words convey.
What do you make of politicians' calls for various forms of censorship against these groups?
Mm-hmm. Well, the term censorship is, of course, a loaded term because it suggests that their First Amendment rights are being violated. And of course, here in the United States, we don't have hate speech laws. I mean, many countries have hate speech laws. In Germany, for instance, there are certain things you can't say or do because it's connected to the Nazi party or Nazism in general. We don't have hate speech rules, laws here. I mean, not at a criminal level. I mean, we have informal hate speech, say at universities or in private institutions, but we don't have hate speech laws. We have First Amendment that says basically you can say whatever you want, but there are exceptions to that. So there's the yelling fire in the theater exception, and that's in a sense incitement. If you can't say I'm going to kill somebody, or I want to kill somebody, or I'm going to kill somebody, and there are various other kinds of examples of speech which are not protected effectively under First Amendment. What's happened since, and this isn't just as a result of January 6th, I mean, there has been a kind of consistent deplatforming of far-right extremist organizations it precedes the Trump election of 2016, but it has gathered steam, if you will, since 2016. So we've seen a number of individuals removed from Facebook, removed from Twitter, and web payments have been shut down to their organizations. And what I think makes January 6th the kind of watershed moment is because finally Donald Trump's account was taken down from Twitter, from Facebook, from YouTube. And hitherto, it had been difficult for executives at Twitter and at other social media companies to make the case for deplatforming certain organizations or certain types of language, because the counter argument was, well, if we take down that statement, or we deplatform that individual, that person or that group basically is saying the same thing as the president. Are we going to take down the president? And of course, that was a step that social media platforms refused to take until January 6th. And on January 6th, they finally decided, well, I mean, this is treason, and that is a category of speech which is not protected under the First Amendment. So I wouldn't call it censorship. I would call it, invoking the exceptions to the First Amendment of the Constitution.
But arguably, that's not what is really guiding them. Would we apply this if Trump advocated for bombing Iran or North Korea very publicly? Or if Elliot Abrams did this, or John Bolton? And is there not a problem with accountability? Who are these institutions accountable to? I mean, Jennifer Palmieri has pointed out that these decisions by these tech giants have been made as the Democrats take power and take power in the relevant committees.
Well, first of all, you're right. I mean, there is a general lack of accountability when it comes to private companies. I mean, Facebook, Twitter, not only are they private companies, but they're powerful private companies. If they were public institutions, there would be a measure of accountability. A measure, not necessary, but there would be at least a possibility of having accountability. At one point, when the internet was kind of wide open and a kind of free-for-all, the accountability was almost individual. It was up to every participant in the internet to kind of police themselves or to engage in collective self-policing. But that was before the internet became market-driven, became an opportunity for extraordinary profit. And so the rules of the internet, which were developed in a kind of anarchic libertarian time, no longer frankly apply to the internet we have today. So I think your point about accountability is absolutely correct. And we do have to develop mechanisms of accountability for such enterprises. With corporations, you have shareholders, and there have been shareholder actions to hold corporations accountable. It's not a particularly strong version of accountability, and so corporations in general lack those accountability mechanisms. So it's not just the internet. I mean, obviously, I believe that we should have greater accountability across the corporate sphere. There have been efforts to tighten accountability. I mean, obviously, in the wake of the 2008-2009 financial crisis, there were efforts to tighten accountability for financial institutions, for banks, investment firms, and so on. Less successful than many of us had hoped for. Your second point about, would they have deplatformed the president if he had advocated or gone through with an attack against a foreign country? Well, obviously they didn't. I mean, the Trump administration assassinated Qasem Soleimani, the head of the Quds Force and the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps in Iran, It was assassinated in Iraq in January of last year. And, there was precious little outcry, much less an effort to penalize those responsible, namely the Trump administration, military, et cetera. So obviously there's kind of a double standard. You could argue about application of accountability to public officials in this country, that they can basically get away with anything they want to do overseas, meddle with other countries, violate other countries' constitutions, violate the institutions, political institutions or economic institutions of other countries. But if they take the step to violate our political institutions, that's a step too far as far as the legal process applies, as well as kind of the corporate mindset. I would prefer it not to be that way. Of course, I'd rather there weren't a double standard, but this is an exceptionalism built into the American system, and it's built into a lot of systems, unfortunately. I mean, it's a national blindness, if you will, that countries will not prosecute their leaders for misdeeds that take place in other countries, but they will prosecute them for misdeeds that take place within their own countries. I hope eventually that double standard will be ironed out or removed and a more consistent approach is taken.
Some people are concerned that over time, these powers by the tech giants will be used not just against those inciting violence, inciting riots, treason, but to go after dissenting voices in the name of fighting conspiracy theories or just any pretext, and also left institutions.
Yeah. That is a concern. There is, from the perspective of a social media company, dissent might look very similar coming from the right and from the left. And so the same kind of filters that are used to remove hate speech or extremism might in fact be used against progressives or the left. That could very well happen. I mean, so far we haven't seen that, as far as I know. I mean, I haven't seen any leftists or progressives deplatformed or organizations deplatformed in the way that the far right has been deplatformed. So the distinguishing characteristic is really calls for violence rather than the content of the dissent itself. Or in the case of, for instance, denial of COVID-19 and its impact, which could be considered a threat to public health. That said, I, of course, could see, a decision made on an ad hoc basis or collectively by social media platforms or internet companies more generally, that dissent, even from the left, constitutes some kind of a hazard to public health or the political health of the country. That's certainly something we've seen in other countries. China has approached the internet in that way. Russia, to a certain extent, has as well, though it's mostly a question of prioritizing state sources of information versus non-state sources of information. And that's not precisely the problem we have in the United States, since we don't have state television exactly. And that's definitely something that we have to guard against. And I think it goes to the earlier point about accountability. There has to be a measure of accountability, public accountability, such that it's not the decision of a given individual or a set of small number of individuals at the head of a company that are making these decisions. There has to be some public input, and the decisions have to be. I'm not imagining them put to a vote exactly, but collectively over time, the actions of social media platforms should be considered by some public entity that goes beyond the FCC, which is kind of just, FCC has a relatively narrow set of determinants about whether you can continue to have a license, for instance, a radio or a TV license. So I think it would have to go beyond that kind of FCC type of watchdog or accountability mechanism.
There have been some changes to the algorithm, and according to the World Socialist Web Site, there was a decrease in traffic for example, Democracy Now! And similar outlets. And I have also interviewed a member of the organization Venezuela Analysis. They have been removed from Twitter at least once, though we were later told it was just a mistake. So there are some cases with the page of Press TV, the Iranian state channel on Facebook, very recently.
There was a newspaper account here in the States, I think it was the New York Times, about press outlets that were considered to be part of the disinformation campaigns in the United States around the election in 2016. And that included, RTV, formerly Russian TV. More recently, given the reports of Iranian interference in the 2020 elections, that has been broadened to include press TV, perhaps. Those are state-run outfits. I would make a distinction between, say, Democracy Now! On the one hand and, RTV or Press TV on the other. Because if a press organization is operating as basically an arm of a government, then it's in a different category in the media sphere. And that goes for, VOA, Voice of America, as well. So I don't exempt the United States from this. There has been evidence, and I find it credible evidence that that RTV, I can't speak to Press TV, but RTV did kind of follow talking points about disinformation from the Russian government. Not all of the shows. I mean, there are lots of different shows on RTV, but some shows. And that contributed to my decision to stop appearing on RTV. I was, I used to just say yes to everybody. I don't care, I don't really care whether it's a state-run outfit or, I'm willing, to appear on pretty much anything. But I was not happy about, basically the opportunity to talk about what was really going on in Ukraine and Russia on RTV. And I appeared for my last time on a show in which I basically talked about Russian interference in Ukraine, and that was it. That was my say goodbye to RTV. But I mean, your point about what might happen in terms of a limitation of expression here in the United States is an important one, and I think we do have to be alert to any kinds of efforts at censoring opinions. And again, that's why I made a distinction between what I consider to be censorship and what I consider to be the basically limitation of incitement to violence and extremism and affiliated with hate. So that's an important distinction, and one that I would hope that any accountability mechanism that we would set up would continue to observe.
Should anti-terrorism laws be applied to those who broke into the Capitol, who stormed the Capitol on January 6th, and should possibly new anti-terrorism laws, domestic extremism laws, be passed?
Well, I don't know that we need new domestic anti-terrorism laws. I think our anti-terrorism laws are pretty robust here in the United States. I mean, for instance, we were able to arrest and eventually put on trial, I imagine, group that plotted to kidnap the Michigan governor, for instance. There have been any number of extremist factions, from the Atomwaffen division here in the United States to the Boogaloo Boys, that committed crimes or plotted to commit crimes, that have been arrested and are going to trial. So I don't think we need new anti-terrorism laws. As for whether the people who broke into the Capitol should be considered terrorists, I mean, terrorism, generally speaking, is an effort to, through violence, I mean, strictly speaking, an effort through violence to change policy. And often it's, against civilians of one sort or another, by civilians against civilians, rather than military targets. But that, I mean, there are exceptions to that. The term terrorism has been used rather loosely. Obviously, it's been used to describe, anti-apartheid campaigners in South Africa. It's been used to describe, civil rights campaigners here in the United States. So it's often used very loosely, which is why I'm hesitant about using the term to describe those who broke into the Capitol. I think there were some who clearly had violent intentions. And I don't mean the violent intention just of breaking into the Capitol, but a violent intention of kidnapping and otherwise doing harm to elected representatives. If that intent can be proven by connecting, their statements online to what was found, on their bodies, ropes, guns, tasers, etc., then the case might be made in court that they had intent to commit violence. But for the vast majority of those people, I think most of them just wanted to get into the Capitol and do mayhem. And that's a criminal offense. Don't get me wrong. I think they should be arrested and they should have to be tried. And there should be a court case about whether they are guilty or innocent. But I would not argue that the vast majority of them were terrorists.